I thought I would take you through kind of an overview of the works of Giddens and Habermas, and then I'm going to dig down into my favorite work of Habermas, the structural transformation of the public sphere, to get a sense of the ways that it is conceptualized and the ways that it might be useful. And because originally I started out kind of throwing up very texty slides, and I wasn't sure how the utility of that, so I went this route. We'll call it a third way in honor of Giddens' somewhat recent book. Anthony Giddens is alive today. He was the head of the London School of Economics until recently. He is actually, I should call him Sir Anthony Giddens. And he has, like these other theorists who've come before him, well, he's a white male as well, but I don't believe he has a beard right now. But he has written many, many works with many, many big ideas in them. So I just thought I would talk about some of the works that are well known, but also that I think are particularly useful for thinking about the society-environment interaction. And he's probably most well known for his work on modernity and on structuration theory. And so I think Lori talked a little bit about how there was this discussion about agency versus structure and thinking about which should be privileged more within traditional social theory. And what Giddens did, and he wasn't necessarily the first to do this, but he perhaps did it in the most aggressive manner. He basically argued that what was necessary was to think about looking at the interactions between agency and structure. And he came up with this novel term, structuration theory, which basically means that we look at agency and structure together as an interaction. And he became quite well known for that work. At the same time, he also is one of the fathers of reflexive modernization, which I'm going to be talking about later today. Perhaps it's most well known as a work by Ulrich Beck, who recently passed away. But Giddens was one of the people who was initially involved in the conversation about reflexive modernization and how to use their term, not mine, so don't roll your eyes at me, a modernization of modernity would lead to alternative ways of thinking about society, technology, and the environment. And I'm gonna talk about that more later, so I didn't want to spend too much time on that given my limited time. One of his most recent theoretical works was a work called The Third Way, which I think it's theoretical, but it also was specifically applying some of his thoughts to thinking about Europe and where Europe was going and to where democratic societies could go moving forward. And that came out in 1998. And from then he actually turned very much towards an applied approach, and he wrote The Politics of Climate Change, which was really not theoretical at all, but I thought I should mention it since we are talking about society and the environment. And he is a social theorist who has tried to weigh it. And I think it's interesting because in some ways this goes back to what Simone was talking about before. And I think that while we are moving into a period where there are these theoretical opportunities for thinking more about social theory moving forward, I also think there is the challenge of a lot of people deciding that they want to stomp in the small pool that is society and the environment with their ideas without actually building on the scholars that have come before them. And I think that Giddens, and other people who have read this, if you don't agree, but I think that in a lot of ways he represents one of a long line of people who have tried to do this in the past 10 years. So that's all I have to say about Giddens. So since I have to also talk about Habermas, and what I basically wanted to do is I thought I would start with a little background on Habermas. Now Habermas is, he's a scholar of the Frankfurt School. He is very well known for his work originally on legitimation, then moving forward looking at civil society and what's called the public sphere, which I'll talk about in a minute. I think it's, the other thing that he's extremely well known for is he wrote a 2-volume very, very dense work called The Theory of Communicative Action. Habermas's whole work is embedded in notions about communication, right? Like communication, like how we talk to one another. And it's worth noting that Habermas was born with a very significant, substantial speech impediment. And to date, people have a very hard time understanding him. He has a very big hair lip. And as a result, it's actually very interesting to think about the ways that he then has spent much of his time trying to understand communication and how we communicate as individuals as well as within society. So I thought that was worthwhile background. Let's see, he when he talks about the theory of communicative action, one of the big things he's thinking about is how we can have communication free from domination and non-power-based dynamics among communication, which obviously is an ideal and not reasonably achievable. But he starts from there and then spends, as I said before, 2 volumes trying to pull apart how that works and how it's situated and what are the powers that pull in different ways on communication. I did want to make one comment about his Legitimation Crisis, which was an early book of his. It's actually in contrast to TCA. We call it TCA because, it's easier that way, which is like this. The Legitimation Crisis is a nice little book. It fits in your back pocket. If you want to open up a little Habermas, I suggest that one. And in the Legitimation Crisis, Habermas very much is engaging with Weber's work on rationalization here. And what he basically, the main question that drives that work, which was one of his earlier works, is a question of how does a state, so like a government, maintain legitimacy when it's very clear that there is an unequal distribution of resources and power. And so the whole work is this conceptual framework for thinking about how legitimation is maintained and even furthered within, the modern state where we do have unequal distribution of everything. So there's that work. So now I come to my favorite work of Habermas's, which is the work on the public sphere. So let's see, Habermas wrote The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere in the 1990s at some point. It was not translated into English until I think 96, and that's when there was this explosion of work around the structural transformation of the public sphere. So I just thought the public sphere is basically seen as this domain where people come together and communicate again. And the idea is that there's this opportunity for rationalized communication, free from domination, where people can actually communicate and discuss, and that is at the heart of democracy. And I thought it was great that Tom was also talking about Dewey, because in a lot of ways this then connects also to some of the Deweyan ideals about democracy as well. His work itself, the book that was the foundation for the structural transformation, or that is the structural transformation that then there's all this other work that has come since on it, talks about first the emergence of the public sphere, and then the transformation is actually how it basically falls apart. And I'll give it away quickly, which is it emerges as a place where the learned people, otherwise known as men, by the way, could get together and talk about politics and have discussions. And initially he pointed out that it was this wonderful place where, to some degree, power was more equalized, so that people who weren't very landed could talk with people who had a lot of land and discuss and debate politics. And it was this idea, and in some ways the beginning of deliberation came from this idea. The transformation happens when you get the real riffraff capable of reading, and you also have women entering the public sphere, and you also have people of color to some degree entering the public sphere. And that's where the whole thing is seen as falling apart within the work. And the transformation itself, so there are lots of things to criticize about the structural transformation of the public sphere, and I can give a list of all the things that have already been written to criticize it. What was very interesting is this idea of, is there a time when people can come together and really have a discussion about democracy? And he argues that it's possible, when there is homogeneity among the actors involved, right? And the problem is that he says that once you get a more diverse crowd involved, the power differentials make it not possible to have this communication that's free from domination, where you can really have a conversation about democracy in a real way. Which I know can sound kind of crazy, but it's really interesting in terms of thinking about communication and discussion and the role that discussion can play and deliberation can play in democracy, which was very, very, in some ways, groundbreaking when he wrote it for thinking about the way that society interacts, and the interaction itself, not just these structures, these static structures of the state that do change, but how do they change? And for Habermas, they change through communication. And communication yields social change in many different ways. And there are lots of works that he has written that talks about the different ways that change happens. But what I think is most important for my Cliff Notes version here is to think about the fact that it's this interaction that's communicative amongst people who know what's going on that enables us to move forward. And I can I'll give an example that's, an An example today would be that Habermas would say that the Trumpism of American politics today shows this decline and failure of the public sphere, because all of a sudden you no longer have learned, experienced people who have been in the government who know how to talk about state making. They instead, all of a sudden, we have these crazy statements that are being made for media attention, and it's no longer a deliberation about how to solve the actual problems that are going on in society, but rather just grandstanding to get attention. So I think that's how he would do it. And since he is still alive, he may very well weigh in on Trump if he ends up being the Republican nominee. So stay tuned for that. But again, so the public sphere itself was originally this idea around the bourgeois public. It was originally in this period of time before many people were very powerful. But a lot of people have embraced the idea because it fits very nicely into thinking about democracy and thinking about citizen participation, but also kind of participation in politics and the way you get from an individual who just votes to being an individual who participates and discusses, and then potentially then democracy reflects the opinions of the populace.